For tonight's lecture, we will take an inquiry-based approach, meaning we are going to ask a lot of questions about the material that I will present you tonight. You will write each of your questions on the discussion board in Canvas, and we will attempt to answer each other's questions based on what you read for tonight and what I have presented you in this lecture. Does that sound good? Any questions so far? If the answer was yes, please pause this recording and ask your question on the discussion board in Canvas called The Technology of Media and Culture. Throughout this presentation, you will be periodically asked to respond to a question that I will ask about a given topic. Take this opportunity to not only respond to my question, but to ask your own or attempt to answer your peers' questions on the discussion board. I would appreciate it if you could please answer at least 2 of your peers' questions on the discussion board before the night is over. Since we have a lot of material to cover, let's get started. We will dive into our topic tonight by looking at the technology of media and culture from a cultural Marxist perspective, stopping along the way to meet some major players in cultural Marxism. We will learn about Martin Heidegger's Dasein. Then, by taking a look at a few dystopian media artifacts, we will apply the cultural Marxist perspective and Heidegger's theory in order to tease out what dystopian media tells us about the importance and implications of certain technologies. Finally, we will take a look at McLuhan and his influences and what he says about the technology of media and culture. Part 1. Meet the Family. Karl Marx was a German philosopher, sociologist, economist, journalist, and a host of other things, who penned a book called Das Kapital, describing the socio-economic struggle of class politics. In his writing, he predicted that the ruling class, who he calls the bourgeoisie, would come into conflict with the lower class, who he calls the proletariat. At that point, chaos would ensue, and the proletariat would become the ruling class, which would in turn redistribute wealth to the masses and create a more economically equal society. While Marx predicted this was going to happen with 100% certainty, World War II came and went, and the uprising still hadn't happened. With Marxism proverbially dead in the water, this new guy pops up. His name is Gramsci. And Gramsci pipes up with a little thing that we know as today called hegemony. So Gramsci was like, well, everything that Marx wrote was cool and all, but since it didn't come to fruition, let's talk about the way that the oppressed are participating in their own oppression. Gramsci posited that the systems in power manipulate those who are not into agreeing with and participating in the very systems that oppress us, and we are never the wiser, or even if we are content with evil that we know, rather than the evil that we don't. However, it's not all doom and gloom. Gramsci also talked about counter-hegemony, which means that the non-dominant class has the potential to have influence over the systems in power. A second important role of Marxism happened in the Frankfurt School. I don't know if you remember the Frankfurt School. We talked about this institution on the first day of the semester. I remember, so I will refresh your memory. Now, the Frankfurt School grounded their philosophical approach to critical theory in Marxism as an approach to society that can be used to explain a variety of disciplines, including economics, philosophy, politics, history, and rhetoric. Because the school was grounded in a critical self-investigation, Marxism allowed the school to take a critical look at capitalism and materialism and the way that these camps assert that real physical objects or conditions give rise to our experiences. From these and many other scholars who had anticipated the Marxist revolution, 3 schools of Marxist thought have emerged that pervade the way that Marxism is used in cultural studies today. The first is the material school, and it follows the old-fashioned, old-school Marxism that believes that rhetoric conceals or reveals political or economic forces that make society run. The second Idealistic Marxism says that the real currency isn't stuff like all of the old Marxism says, it's ideas. The structures of power thus seek to control the way that the masses think about the power structures in the world, in turn making the power systems appealing to the individual. And here is where hegemony lives. Finally, the relativist perspective looks at the linguistic structures we use as tools of our oppression, stating that language builds reality. Now take a moment and think about our friends Marx, Gramsci, and the good old Frankfurt School, and go to the discussion board on Canvas and ask some questions that you have about my summary, or if I've missed something, go ahead and add to my overview. Part 2, Dasein. Martin Heidegger was a German philosopher. He was known for the book Being and Time, written in 1927. In the book, Heidegger focuses on the analysis of, you guessed it, being. By analyzing what the author calls the existential paradox of Dasein, or being there, as it is translated in English, he contemplates the experience of being that is particular to humans. Thus, the author states that Dasein is a form of being that is aware of and must confront issues such as personhood, which the author defines as a general term pertaining to a person with the capacity for reason, morality, consciousness, participating in social relationships and structures, relationships with other human beings, with the dilemma of ultimately being alone with oneself, and mortality. While the book is dense and convoluted, it is a pillar of philosophical thought, but for our purposes, we will summarize the ideas in Being and Time as follows. Being in the world, it is the things around us, like technology, that make us aware of our existence, or potential to not exist, aka mortality. We do not consciously acknowledge these things that help us successfully go about our daily lives until the object is no longer available for our use. Kind of like when you forget your cell phone at home and you're painfully aware that you are without it. And then you realize throughout the day how useful it really is to you. Heidegger says that these experiences remind us of our own mortality and allow us to live authentically. There are two terms that come from Heidegger that are important to acknowledge. The first is authenticity, which is defined as an understanding of the world around us based on personal experience rather than of institutionally based constructions of what makes one an individual. So in this instance, the individual is using lived experiences rather than, for example, what Apple is telling us will make us an individual, or what Nike will tell us is going to make us stand out in a crowd. Second is the term own most. The importance of authenticity relies on the individual acknowledging the idea that personal experience is an acknowledgement of one's own mortality, and therefore because we all must experience death alone, meaning we can't really take anyone with us, then we must also experience life with this acute awareness. While this is a little bit dark, you're going to have to stick with me because the idea of own most is chiefly related to death. If you're feeling a little confused, let's take a look at a second definition of what Heidegger has to say in the 8-Bit Philosophy video, Are You Authentic? Upon watching this video, we will talk about it and you'll have the opportunity to ask a few more questions on the discussion board. Now that you've watched the video, Are You Authentic? Let's think about the way that dystopian media uses technology to develop the storyline of the protagonist and how he or she achieves their own most. How does that show us, the viewer, that we should be developing our own most in our own lives? Now would be a good time to pause and take a 10-minute break. When you resume the lecture, we will look at some media artifacts and try to answer these questions.